Hello everyone. For this week's online part of the class, we're going to finish covering the skull. Now, in class, remember I went over some vocabulary, we learned some important terms. I also went over the beginning of the list on page 5, and we covered the cranium. The goal of the rest of the week is to finish the skull so that we can move on to the rest of the skeleton. Now, if you look on page 5, remember we finished in class covering the temporal bone. And if we look at our list here, we have the temporal bone, and then below the temporal bone, we have the rest of our list on the left-hand side, and then the column continues on the right-hand side. I'm going to split this information into 2 videos, so make sure you watch both of them. But in this first video, we're going to cover all of the rest of the bones, with the exception of 2 in the skull that I'm going to save for the second video. And then you'll be all caught up. Now, I decided not to just do a show and tell where I held a skull and pointed to the bones, but I think it's easier with these online sessions to just show you a picture and to kind of go through the list with a picture. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you this picture, and we're going to run through the different bones with some diagrams. Now I'm going to take my list, and we're just going to continue to go through our list and cover the rest of the skull. So if you look under the temporal bones, you see the next bone is the lacrimal bone. The lacrimal bone is a bone that, is in your eyeball socket, and it's this green bone on my demo skull picture here. This green bone is our lacrimal bone. Now, the lacrimal bone is named after your tears. So structures that involve your tears, like your tear ducts, your tear glands, they're all called lacrimal. So your lacrimal glands and your lacrimal ducts are all involved with tears. And so because this lacrimal bone is in your eyeball socket, it has the name associated with your tears. So the lacrimal bone, that's pretty easy. Now there's nothing else with the lacrimal bone that we need to know, so we're just going to move right on to the maxilla. Our maxilla is this bone that makes up your face. So it holds your upper teeth, and it makes up the front of your face. If I scroll down to my other picture, it's this green bone here. So this green bone that makes up the front of our skull is the maxilla. You actually have 2. You have a left and a right, but you don't have to worry about that. It's split into a left side and a right side. Just know the maxilla. Now there's one structure on the maxilla that you need to know, and it's this foramen, this hole. The hole is called the infraorbital foramen. This infraorbital foramen is just named because infra is below, orbital is your eyeball socket, and then foramen is hole. So literally it's the below your eyeball socket holes. They're very prominent on every skull, and you shouldn't have any trouble finding those infraorbital foramen. Now our next bone is making up part of the roof of our mouth. Now, the maxilla makes up part of the roof of your mouth, and these other bones, called the palatine bones, make up the rest of the roof of your mouth. So if you look at my third diagram here, you'll see here's our upper teeth. We're looking at the inferior aspect of our skull, or the bottom of our skull. Now, this pink bone is all your maxilla. So it makes up most of the roof of your mouth. But then on the back part, or back area, is a different bone. It's this whitish bone. And that whitish bone is your palatine bones. So your palatine bones are going to make up the back portion of the roof of your mouth. The rest of it is your maxilla. Now I'm going to go quickly back to our list. I'm going to move my list back. Let's look at this list really quick. So if you look at the list, under the palatine bones, it says the hard palate. Now, our hard palate is simply the entire roof of your mouth, okay? And then it says the palatine bones and the palatine process of the maxilla make up your hard palate. Now, what you need to know for the test is just that this upper portion of your the roof of your mouth is the maxilla. The bottom part's the palatine bone. The entire roof of your mouth is just called the hard palate. And that hard palate is going to be not a bone, but kind of a composite structure. There's a few composite structures that you need to know. They're on your list also on page 5, and the hard palate's one of them. Let me show you. So see, if I move my list, it says composite structures, nasal septum, zygomatic arch, hard palate. These are just multiple bones that make up a structure. We call it a composite structure. So that's our first one. Okay, so the palatine bones. Now we've got this next bone is called the zygomatic bone. And so the zygomatic bone, kind of a funny name. It's got several structures that we need to know along with the zygomatic bone. And the zygomatic bone is essentially your cheek. So I'm going to go back to this frontal view, and our zygomatic bone, the zygomatic bone actually kind of reminds me of Texas, just kind of the shape of it. It's this orange bone, it's your cheekbone. So the cheekbone that's orange here, see, it kind of looks like Texas if you use your imagination. It is the zygomatic bone. Now if I go up here on the side, it's this blue bone. This blue bone is our zygomatic bone. Now the zygomatic bone has a couple structures that you have to know. It's the temporal process, then it has this thing called the zygomaticofacial foramen, and then a structure called the zygomatic arch. Well, first of all, let's just cover this temporal process. So if you recall when we learned the temporal bone had a process coming off of it called the zygomatic process. The zygomatic process actually attaches to the zygomatic bone. The zygomatic bone has a process that sticks out that attaches to the temporal bone. So we call that area right here of the zygomatic bone the temporal process. Now this always confuses students, but the zygomatic bone has the temporal process. The temporal bone has the zygomatic process. The zygomatic process and the temporal process make this arch on the side of your cheek, and that whole arch is called the zygomatic zygomatic arch. So you can see it right here. This is just another picture of it. You see the yellow bone here is our zygomatic bone. The pink bone is the temporal bone. Now, the temporal bone has this zygomatic process. The zygomatic bone has the temporal process. The temporal process and the zygomatic process form this arch called the zygomatic arch. This is always confusing to students, so just make sure you review it. Just keep going over it. The process names are the bone names flip-flopped. So the temporal bone has the zygomatic process, the zygomatic bone has the temporal process. And that is really the zygomatic bone that you need to know. All right. So there's also another structure called the zygomaticofacial foramen. And the zygomaticofacial foramen is a little foramen that's on the zygomatic bone, but I'm actually going to have you cross that out. So on this, just cross this out and don't worry about the zygomaticofacial foramen. I'm not going to have it on the test. A lot of the artificial skulls don't have it, and so just don't worry about it. And then, of course, I just covered that zygomatic arch. All right, so we're in great shape. Let's move on. The top of the next column is the vomer bone. The vomer has a few structures that we need to know. The vomer is a small bone that is located on the front of our skull, or we'll see it on the frontal view. So if we look directly at our skull, you'll notice that your nose hole contains a line that goes through it, this bone, this like wall. It's a divider. Now, any divider is called a septum. And septums are going to split things in two. Just think septum splits. So this divider in our nose is called the nasal septum. All right? This nasal septum. And the bottom portion, if you notice there's a slightly different color here, that bottom portion of the nasal septum is our vomer. All right? So on the list, it says the vomer has the nasal septum, and I'll get to the other part of the nasal septum here in our next video, but the top portion is a different bone. You need to, right now, just focus on this vomer, which is the bottom portion of your nasal septum. Now, the nasal septum is also one of those composite structures. Okay, so that takes care of our vomer. And then also on the list, you're going to see under vomer, you're going to see where it says inferior nasal conchae and then nasal bones. Now, the nasal conchae are these little flaps that are on the inside of your nose hole. So you see these little flaps? Those are the nasal concha. Now, I am not going to have you differentiate between the nasal concha. So where it says inferior, you can just kind of mark off the word inferior and just know these nasal flaps as your nasal concha. All right? You actually have 3 pairs of them, but I'm not going to have you worry about identifying the different pairs. I just want you to know that these nose flaps are called nasal concha. All right? And then the next bone is the nasal bone. Well, that is the bridge of your nose. So in this picture, the orange bone here is your nasal bone. And pretty simple, you know, your glasses sit on your nasal bone. If I go up here, you can see this dark blue. The dark blue bone is the nasal bone. All right, so that takes care of those bones. See, we're cruising right along here. We'll get done with this. It won't be too bad. Now, the next 2 bones, the sphenoid and ethmoid bone, these are the 2 bones I'm going to skip and put into our second video. Sorry, it's getting a little blurry as I try and move the paper. So we're going to skip those 2 just for now. Check out the next video and you'll see the sphenoid and ethmoid bone. Let's go ahead and finish this list. Piece of cake. We only have 2 bones left. The mandible and the hyoid bone. Now, the mandible, most people know the mandible. It's your lower jaw. So this right here is your mandible. All right. And there's a couple of structures that you need to know on the mandible. First of all, it says you have to know the mandibular condyle and then the mental foramen. Now, the mandibular condyle is, I don't know if I have a really good picture of it. I guess this is the best one. So this red bone, of course, is our mandible. The mandibular condyle is the rounded knob that makes up your joint, your jaw joint. That's kind of weird to say, but your jaw joint is the mandibular condyle right here going into the temporal bone. Let's see if I can get a different color on my pointer. So this is our mandibular condyle. Now look, the front has a process you don't need to know. Don't worry about this. It's the back, this rounded knob. Remember, a condyle is a rounded knob at a joint. So this rounded knob at a joint is the condyle. It's on the mandible, so we call it the mandibular condyle. What does it attach to? It attaches to the temporal bone. Remember, the temporal bone had the mandibular fossa, so your mandibular condyle fits into the mandibular fossa of the temporal bone. So you have that, and then we've got two little holes, two little foramen on the chin of your mandible. These are called the mental foramen. So the mental foramen are the two little holes on your mandible that is in the front there where your chin is. Now, it seems weird that we call this the mental foramen, right? So you've got these mental foramen. And you'd think, okay, mental foramen, when just logically you'd think that it would be up on your head somewhere, mental for thinking. But look at this. When you think, you put your fingers on your mental foramen. That famous statue, the thinker. So it makes sense when you look at it that way. Okay, enough of that. All right, so our last bone is the hyoid. And the hyoid is actually not a bone of the skull. The hyoid sits below the skull. It's actually a bone that floats. It doesn't attach to any other bone. This is what it looks like. It looks kind of like a horseshoe. But it sits below the skull, and it has some muscles of your tongue attaching to it. It's got some muscles of your throat attaching to it. And so it is actually not part of your skull. Now, here's a little bit of trivia that I like to share in class that I usually put on as extra credit. Your hyoid bone is the only non-articulated bone in your body. In other words, it's the only bone that doesn't attach to another bone. It literally floats out there in your throat. So if you're an archaeologist, it's almost 100% guarantee that you will never find a hyoid bone when you discover a skeleton. Because it's just floating there, it's the first bone to just get lost and washed away. So there's no ligaments that are holding it in place. Okay, so that takes care of video 1. So just go through that list. You can watch this video a couple times, of course. Make sure that you feel comfortable with the bones of the skull. If you need a little bit of supplemental instruction, check out Dr. Shea's video where she talks about these bones, but is in the lab class and is showing you an actual skull. And she's showing the skull and she's pointing to all of the structures. In video number 2, I'm going to cover the other 2 bones I skipped, the sphenoid and the ethmoid bone. So make sure to check